Hey everyone, and welcome to the Retro Channel, and today we are looking at the good old Game Gear. I think the Game Gear is probably the best console of its generation, but at the same time the screen on these things is absolutely terrible. So what I'm going to be looking at today is a brand new screen replacement from BennVenn. For those of you that have been around the channel for a while, you'll probably remember that I did a previous install of the last BennVenn screen in this Game Gear. This was the original IPS screen, and since then Ben has developed a new screen called the Game Gear HD. This is another IPS screen, but it has a 640 by 480 resolution, so that's pretty much double what the original Game Gear screen was. It boasts high-def integer scaling, no shimmer or tearing, an on-screen display, retro pixel, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean, scan lines and scaling modes, master system support, and the lowest power consumption. So I guess the first thing I want to do is see what the power consumption is with an original screen. That way we can have a baseline once we replace this thing, and I'll also check out the power consumption from the previous IPS kit. And powering on the system, it draws 268 milliamps at 9 volts. So that's probably good enough for a baseline. Let's see what's included in this new kit. Now, full disclosure, Ben did send this over to me for review, so I did not pay for this screen, but I'm also not being paid to review it. So let's see what we have. And first of all, oh yes, we have a HDMI connection. If you saw my video on adding HDMI to one of the original Game Gears, this pretty much sits at the bottom of the Game Gear, but you do have to cut out a little notch for the HDMI connector to sit in. So I think this is more or less the same thing, but instructions are pretty much non-existent at this point. I think Ben has only just released this particular kit, which I believe is revision 2, so I don't even know what revision 1 was like, to be perfectly honest, but he did mention that the instructions are coming soon, so I hope to see them sooner rather than later. And, well, I hope that I can actually get this installed, assuming that it's all straightforward. So what we have, by the looks of it, is a flat flex cable, and it looks like this has got a little bit bent in packaging, but that shouldn't be a big deal. There's a set of 3 wires and a touch module, so this would be like a sensor touch kind of thing. I think this might be for the on-screen display. Obviously we've got the screen bracket, and in our other little baggie here, we have the screen itself with the required electronics on the back. So let's pop open our Game Gear, get the original screen out, and see if we can get this one installed. And there was only one screw holding this together. Ah yes, this looks like one of the ones I got in a faulty lot many years ago, and it basically, whoever tried to recap it the first time did a terrible job, and I replaced those. But looking around, I can see that my work isn't exactly fantastic either, but that was a couple of years ago, so I'm sure I could do better now. But I think it goes without saying at this point, if your Game Gear has not been recapped, that is the first thing you want to do before you try to do any other mods. These all have leaking capacitors, and they will eventually eat the PCB until it's not worth repairing. So if you haven't recapped your Game Gear, do it now, do not wait. Anyway, let's disconnect these connections to the power board and the soundboard and the speaker. And we've got to take out a few screws in order to get to the front of this thing and remove the original screen. Alrighty, we can put all that aside for now. Let's get this old screen off. And for that, we just need to peel back this tape over here. Let's rip that off for now, and we just need to remove the actual bracket holding the original screen in. And I've just noticed there's a little bodge wire here. Oh, this is a region switching mod that I did many years ago. So One of the pins on the Game Gear ASIC determines the region of the Game Gear, and I think it's pulled down for Japanese models and pulled up for global models, and I just basically lifted that pin and wired it to the left control of the D-pad. So holding left on this actually switches the region, but when you're playing something in-game, the Game Gear just pretty much ignores that. But we may need to remove that wire, which isn't such a big deal. We'll see if it gets in the way once we get this old screen off. It looks to be quite a bit of flux residue under here. I'm not sure if that's normal, but not a big deal. We're going to apply some fresh flux. Just going to use some no clean stuff. Throw a little bit of solder on my iron, and then we're just going to come in and just slowly lift up and work our way along this flat flex. That is it. That is off. And did I lift a pad there? Possibly. It looks like I lifted that pad right in the middle. That's not a big deal. I don't think we need to solder to that anyway. But you want to try and at least keep most of the pads intact for this thing, because I think we do need to connect them with the new screen. I'm just going to get a little bit more flux on here and just clean up those pads with some desoldering braid. So let's just have a look at this flat flex and we'll see what needs to connect to where. So this side probably comes up over here, and I think this little loop here hooks over the second pin. So I'm pretty sure it sits something like that. So you want to at least make sure you keep these pads intact. Otherwise you're going to have to find alternative points to connect these wires to. So rather than having this one flap in the breeze, I could glue it back down, but I think because we're not going to need it anymore, I'm just going to cut that off. So there we go. I lost 2 pads, but I'm not really worried about it because I have no intention of reinstalling the original screen. And yeah, getting that back on there is a challenge in itself. So that can go on eBay for 50 bucks instead. All right, now we don't have the screen flapping about. Let's remove this CCFL, and I think these 2 fuses can also go because they're not going to be any use without that backlight there anymore. So we need to desolder this point here. So I'm just going to add some fresh stuff to get it flowing a little bit better. And this point over here. And these 2 fuses which connect top and bottom on either side. Let's see if we can get away just using the manual pump for this one. Let's see how that went. Oh, the screen wants to come out, almost. All right. Now I'm assuming that we also need to remove the inductor at L2, so this guy right here. I'm just going to do that anyway because I believe that's just part of the boost control circuit for the backlight, which obviously isn't there anymore. So I think this may potentially get in the way if you don't remove it. I just walked that one out. All right, with that all done, our board should be ready to accept the replacement screen. So just looking at this bracket, it would appear that this hole is going to line up with one of these, so it's going to have to go this way somehow. So then our screen, well, it doesn't make sense to put it that way, so it's obviously going to go that way. I can see some of the screw holes have lined up, so I'm just going to throw a couple of screws in this and then give it some tweaking. Also going to peel this off because I don't want it to get trapped by the actual screen holder later on. So that is now off, and already there's a speck of dust on the screen. There we go. Of course, I don't want to over tighten these too much because it is just a 3D printed bracket. Just want to get it enough to stop that screen from actually moving around. There we go, that is not moving. And everything at the front side looks just about right. Let's do a quick test fit in the case, just to be sure. Oh yes, and of course we need to get rid of this screw post because that doesn't fit with the replacement screens. Come in here, just hack at it. Alright, that'll do for now. I'll have to come in and just clean up this lens later on anyway, so let's just do a quick test fit before we go soldering anything else. So it does feel like that's in place. It seems to push up a little bit on the bottom of the board, but I think with a couple of screws that shouldn't be a big deal. And yeah, everything looks normal from the front, but we're going to have to get in there and clean up that lens first anyway. So now for the fun part. So this appears to sit over all these points here. So it's going to sit something like that, and then we've got little bits coming off the flat flex. Obviously this part wraps around to the front, which I showed before, and these guys, well, I guess we'll figure that out soon enough, but I may have to move that capacitor and my little bodge wire. We'll see. So I guess I'll just start by tinning up these pads on the LCD itself, and then we can at least attach this part of the ribbon, and then we'll figure out what to do with all these flappy bits. I'm not going to add huge blobs, just enough to coat the pad. So I'm going to throw a little bit of no clean flux over this flex cable. And I think first I'll just tack in this final connection over here. Alright, with that just tacked in loosely, we can now sort of fine tune where this is going to sit. Something around there seems to look pretty good. Let's tack in this top one. I'm not sure if doing the bottom one next is the best idea, but yeah, what the hell. I think at this point we're good to tack in the rest. They all look to be lining up, and this is still somewhat maneuverable, so we can sort that out in a minute. Let's just go ahead and solder the rest of these in. All right, I think that's all looking pretty good for now, so let's move on to figuring out how the rest of this is supposed to work. So it looks like this ribbon is for the VA1 and VA0 revisions. Mine is a VA0, and mine is also one of the early ones. The later ones actually have gold pads on the back behind where the D-pad is, and I'm pretty sure the same over where these buttons normally are, but mine is one of the very early models, I guess. Whether or not that's going to cause issues, I guess we're about to find out. So just looking at this ribbon, we have a little clock connection just here, and there's also one up here. So I think that's going to be for the VA1 models, so we should be able to just cover that up with a little bit of Kapton tape, and we're going to connect this pad here to the clock signal, which I believe on this particular board is in the middle of these two resistors. I think the ones with the gold pads behind the D-pad have a little ferrite bead next to this crystal, and it's a bit easier to solder to, but being as this is a very early version, I need to get this pad soldered in between those two resistors. That should be fun. First of all, with just a little bit of Kapton tape, I'm just gonna stick it to the back of this, then fold it over just to isolate that other connection. I'm just going to get some fresh solder on the top side of this lower resistor. Right, that's connected, but not a very good joint, so throw a drop of flux in there. Just do that again. All right, that looks better. I'm happy with that. Now the other thing flapping about is T10. There's one hanging around up here and there's one down here. So I'd say this is for the VA1 models because it doesn't seem to connect to anything close by on this version. And this one up here certainly wouldn't connect to that because that's ground. Must be somewhere. T10 is up there, so why this heads off this way, I have no idea. Perhaps that's again related to this very early version. Am I going to be able to bring that the other way without breaking anything? Well, it looks like it'll reach. Not ideal, but it can be done. Let's prep that pad. Bit of extra flux. All right, with T10 connected, I guess we can just isolate the other T10 connection, which would be for the other Game Gear models. So just a little bit more capped on tape. That should do it. And so this little loop goes to the second pin, which is now just underneath the screen. So that's going to be a tricky one to solder to, but I'm just going to prep that pin with some fresh solder before I go any further. Sorry, you're not going to be able to see this on camera because I can barely see it myself. So I've just thrown a bit of fresh solder over that, and now I'm just going to get that hooked around there, come back in with the soldering iron, and that seems to have flowed just fine. So we're good there. Now we just need to line the rest of this up. I think these are supposed to come around that way. We'll worry about that stuff in a minute. Let's get these connectors lined up properly. That's looking pretty good there. Just see if we can get the first one tacked in. I'm pretty happy with that, so I'm going to tack in the other end of this connection. Doesn't have to be pretty just yet, I just want to make sure this thing is in place. And now I'm just going to get some flux over here. Load up my tip with a little bit of solder, there's already some on there. We should be able to just flow the rest of these. Yes, it's going to need more flux. Alright, that looks pretty good. I might just double check the connections from the actual pads here to these little spots on the flat flex cable. I think they're designed for like alternate wiring, but it's also handy just to use as a little connection test. So let's just see. So that's going to there. That also seems good. Goes there somewhere. That's good. That seems good. And ground, well, that's ground. And then this connection here should go up here, and that's also good. So I think this is all good. Now we just need to work out what these are supposed to connect to. So I'm pretty sure these two should connect to the up and down buttons, so this one and this one. And the other thing, I thought it said start button or something on it. BennVenn start button ribbon. Now the start button is up here. So why is this over here? Okay, so after a bit of digging around on the Discord server, apparently this start button ribbon is actually a separate thing. Guess it's just been attached like this to save production costs, but it was a bit confusing having it already attached. That would explain why there's such very small connections in between here. So I just need to carefully cut this away without cutting anything else. Right, so that's actually a separate piece. We'll get back to that. So this one definitely goes to the up pad. Where does this go? Does this go to the down? Yes. And those 2 points are not connected, so that seems right. Let's tin those up. Bring this over and just drop a little bit of flux on there. Alright, and we'll just double check those connections. So we should have a connection from here to the down pad and from here to the up pad. That should be it for the front side. I think the last thing to do is just work out this start button ribbon. So apparently it connects from this point here over to here somewhere. Let's just have a look at my previous one, which, yes, has many more wires in it. Certainly not as pretty, not my finest work, but I think it's this one, which is the right-hand side of resistor R30. And yeah, that runs to a very similar pad on the old board. That pad just there. Just going to go right there. Very good. And then the other side, there's R30 right there, so it needs to go on the right-hand side of that. Let's tin that up. Bring some flux in. All right, I think that's about it. There is still the HDMI side to deal with, but I think we should just give this thing a test first, make sure that everything works as expected. All right, obviously this thing needs a clean, but for now, let's just see if it actually works. Power on. And I see nothing. Well, that was just my cartridge. Okay. It automatically pops up with a little menu, and the up and down buttons appear to be working, so that's good. How do we... Okay. The start button changes the selected option. Alright, well, we'll get back to all that. I'm not seeing any color out of this, though. It looks very black and white. How do we... I guess we just save. Does that make it go away? Well, it appears to be kind of working. I think we need to install this little touch sensor. That's what I forgot about. Where does that go? Alright, we are back. It is the following day and I just could not get this Game Gear to work reliably with the new screen. I thought it could be some wiring issue, but even after taking out the flat flex cable and putting in my own wiring, which I double, triple, quadruple checked, it still wouldn't display the right colors. So I'm not sure what's up with this particular Game Gear, but it does seem to be a fault with this one in particular, because I actually reinstalled the screen in another Game Gear. This is the same model, a VA0 version, and as you can see, everything appears to work just fine. But we do still need to sort out the little wireless touch module and also the HDMI. So before we get too far into this, let's sort those things out, get them installed. Now, as for the little touch module, this basically opens up the on-screen display. So it's a touch sensor, which means you can mount it on the inside of the case somewhere, and that'll sense that it's being touched from the outside. Now honestly, I spent a few minutes wondering where I should place this thing, because obviously you want to have it somewhat accessible when you're actually using the console. So if your hands are placed here, then I guess the best place would be down the bottom at the front here. That way you're not having to put the console down to touch something. And of course you don't want to have it somewhere where your hands are already going to be placed, otherwise you'll be accidentally touching it all the time. But to be honest, I don't think I'll be using it that much, so I'm not actually going to install this thing, because there is another way we can open up the on-screen display without this thing. All we need to do is take a wire from point 4 here and connect that to 5 volts, and then holding down the start button on the Game Gear for a few seconds will open up the menu. So that's what I'm going to do instead, and if you were to wire this thing up, you'd just wire up VCC to the 5 volts, ground to ground, and the I/O pin to that pad 4. But yeah, I don't know how many people are actually going to use this thing, given you can use the start button to achieve the same thing, so is it really necessary? I don't know. So I'm just going to take one of these wires from the kit and just tear off a small piece. It doesn't need to be very long. That should do. So I'm just going to solder this to 5 volts. And the other side is just going to go to this pad just above the ribbon cable. Trying not to burn the ribbon cable itself, or the flat flex. Now, as for HDMI output, I'm probably not actually going to install this thing, because I already have a Game Gear that has HDMI output. I did a video on the little HDMI mod a few months back, close to a year back probably, and yeah, I don't really need two consoles with HDMI out. So this obviously has version 1 of the IPS screen, and I guess this console won't get as much use anymore because I now have an even better screen than this one, but I've got HDMI in the old one. And I don't particularly want to go cutting this case again, but what if? There we go, after a quick rear case swap, I now have a cutout for HDMI with the good screen Game Gear, and I'll figure out what to do with that later. So normally you'd need to cut out the bottom of the case a little bit in order to fit the HDMI connector in. So you need something like that. And this, it's actually resin printed, just sits over this post at the bottom here. Just like so. And then you have your HDMI output. So we can just wire this straight into this connector here. So it needs to go in this way with the blue part facing up towards us. And then lock that down. And then we just want to make sure it doesn't get in the way of the cartridge port. All right. It's closed. So I got the ribbon mostly straight down beside the cartridge port. And there's room at the bottom here for it to do its little twists and turns. Let's just make sure we can plug something in there. Oh yeah, perfect. Let's do it. Well, I have to say, first impressions, the screen looks absolutely amazing. Like, the black levels on this thing is like pitch black. Just look at that. I mean, I thought the original screen was amazing when it first came out with the IPS panel, but this one is next level. Let's just do a little comparison. So that's the original IPS screen up the top, and this is the new one down the bottom. I have to say that the old one appears brighter by just a little bit, but it is a very bright room in here, so even at this level, that's perfectly fine for any gameplay. Colors are definitely a lot more vibrant on this one, and whether or not the camera is going to show up, there is a lot more detail in here. The pixels just look that little bit sharper. Yeah, definitely the color. I much prefer the color on this one. Sonic almost looks light blue or purple on that one. The new screen's definitely the winner here. Now in terms of power consumption, the old IPS screen is drawing 293 milliamps at 9 volts. I think the original screen in this thing drew a similar amount. Let's see what the new screen draws. And so we're just sitting at the EverDrive menu, and this is at full brightness. The new screen draws about 227 milliamps. So yeah, that's definitely a big power saving there. That's quite impressive. Considering it's also pushing around a lot more pixels at the same time. So let's take a look at this on-screen display. So we should be able to hold start for a few seconds to bring it up. And we have the option of outputting to either the IPS panel or HDMI, which obviously isn't working because I don't have HDMI plugged in at the moment. We have some scanline modes. So there are vertical scan lines, horizontal scan lines, and it looks like a combination of horizontal and vertical, but they don't seem to be uniform. Possibly that's down to the scaling mode. Alright, so we have two options for that. There's either one that fits within the original Game Gear frame, or there's a slightly stretched horizontal mode, which I guess you'd have to either cut out a bit of the frame or just live with it, I guess. But yes, the vertical scan lines do look correct in that scaling mode, and they look slightly off with the smaller scaling mode. There's also a frame lock option. I'm guessing that's there to reduce any lag. I'm not sure if it applies to both the internal screen and the HDMI connection. And there is mode which is currently locked to Game Gear because it is Game Gear game, so I guess that would be SMS if we were playing a Master System game. OSD delay is just how long you need to hold the start button until the menu pops up or disappears. So looks like there's 9 settings. There's also a T setting. Maybe that's for the touch button that I didn't install. So I'm sure if I set that to say, let's say 7, oh yeah, it takes a lot longer. Probably too long in my opinion. And the reason the time stopping is because by hitting the start button, I'm also pausing the game at the same time. So I guess that's one benefit of the touch button. It won't be pausing the game every time, but yeah, I can live with that. Yeah, it looks awesome. I don't know how else to describe it. It looks pretty much perfect. I can't really fault it. I shouldn't have jumped. Should have sound. There we go. Oh, no pinball. So yeah, that's the idea of the options with a Game Gear game. Let's see what it looks like with a Master System game. I'm just going to throw in the Easy Flash cartridge, which has some bad connections on it, I think. In fact, let's load up the Master System test suite. Okay, that all looks pretty normal. Grid pattern looks accurate. I'm not seeing any, oh, maybe there is a slight scaling issue with that. Let's see what the other scaling mode looks like. Oh, okay. So in Master System mode, it actually shrinks the screen a little bit, but that is integer scaled. I'm guessing the bigger scaling mode is not integer scaled. So it depends if you want the full screen or accurate pixels. Don't think you're going to notice during gameplay. Let's take a look at linearity. Okay, so that appears to be stretched vertically. Doesn't seem to change too much with the different scaling modes either. They both appear stretched vertically. I don't know if that's down to putting a Master System game on a Game Gear, or if it's the screen, or if it's just this test suite. I'm not sure. Apart from that, everything else looks good as you'd expect. Don't know about that linearity though. Let's go to the Game Gear test suite, see if it looks the same. Check out the grid. Okay, so that looks perfect, no problems there. And that's with the scaling mode at 1. And if we change it to 0, well, it still kind of looks perfect. I don't know which one is the correct one. Let's have a look at linearity. Yes, this is also changing the menus for both things. All right, so that looks pretty circular. And yeah, that scaling mode at 0, where it stretches it horizontally slightly, actually looks oval shaped. It looks like the circles are actually stretched horizontally. So I'm going to leave the scaling mode on 1 for the Game Gear stuff, because that actually looks correct to my eye. But I'm not sure what's up with the Master System mode. Yeah, it definitely doesn't look the correct linearity. Let's try the HDMI output, see if that's any different. Alright, so we've got HDMI working. Unfortunately, it didn't want to play nice with my capture device, so I've hooked it directly up to the plasma display here. But at least we can now see the HDMI output. Now, obviously, this won't include audio, as obviously it's only DVI over a HDMI connector, but the actual speaker in the Game Gear still functions, and you can also use the 3.5mm headphone output if you wanted to. Let's have a look at this linearity. Okay. So that looks correct to me. So I'm not sure why it looks different on the actual internal screen. Let's try out. Oh, okay. So scaling modes don't work with the HDMI output, but the scanline modes do. Not that I really want scanlines on anyway. Let's just have a look at the grid. Yeah, that looks correct, I guess. It's kind of hard to tell without comparing it with an actual Master System, but yeah, that looks correct to me. The linearity looks perfect, so I'm not sure why a HDMI output has the correct linearity while the internal display doesn't seem to, but it could be a number of things. Maybe the internal display is getting that wrong, maybe the HDMI output is getting that wrong, maybe the test suite has got it wrong. I don't know. Let's have a look at the Game Gear version. And yeah, linearity on the Game Gear version also looks correct with the HDMI output. And scaling mode still does not work over HDMI. Scanlines do though. So I don't know about that. Everything seems correct when output over HDMI, but not on the internal display, at least not for the Master System side. Although the Game Gear side does look correct with the internal display. Figure that out. What I will say though is it's pretty cool having HDMI out of the Game Gear, even though I've done a video on this before. This new screen mod just sort of incorporates everything and makes the install a little bit easier. So what do I think about BennVenn's latest HD IPS screen? I think it's fantastic. I think it's a great upgrade for any Game Gear. Now, if you've already got one of his original IPS screens, then well, I don't know. I guess it depends how much you really enjoy playing Game Gear games. It's certainly an upgrade over the original one. Is it worth you pulling out an original one if you've got one already installed? That's up to you, I guess. The HDMI output is a neat option. It's certainly a lot better than the original option, which relied on a Tang Nano to do the heavy lifting. This one is all sort of built into the screen itself, so that's a great upgrade. The little touch module, like I said, I'm not a huge fan of using this. I don't really see much point, but I guess that's up to you. And overall, even with those odd linearity issues, I think it's still a great upgrade for any Game Gear. It certainly beats the old McWheel screens. Even the original IPS screen beat those out. This one just takes it to the next level. It's nice that there's scanline options there, even though I probably won't be using them because I'm not a massive fan of artificial scanlines, but it's neat that they're there. The lower power consumption is definitely a bonus. I mean, I did all these tests with full brightness, but you can still turn the brightness down. That's minimum brightness, and it's still passable for this room. I mean, like I said, it's very bright in here, so I'd normally run it pretty close to full brightness for this amount of lighting. Now for the things that I'm not happy about. The install process is still quite tricky. I guess that's just the way it is with Game Gears. They're not the easiest thing to put new screens into. I do appreciate the flat flex cable, although to be honest, I'm happy just running point-to-point wires as well, but maybe that's just me. I think if you can recap a Game Gear successfully, then you should be able to tackle this mod, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it for anyone who's, you know, just a beginner solderer or your first time soldering. This is certainly not the mod for you. Beyond that, I think this is definitely a very worthy upgrade for anyone looking for a new screen for their Game Gear. I wouldn't consider any other screens at this point apart from this one. So I guess that is it for this video. Like I said, this thing has only just come out, so hopefully we'll see some improvements on the instruction side in the near future. But I'd like to thank you all for watching, liking, subscribing, all that YouTube bullshit. And of course, a massive thanks to the people that support the channel on Patreon. If you want to do the same, links to that down in the video description. And thank you to Ben for sending this out for me to test. I think it's a great product. You've done a great job here. Just get those instructions done. All right, that is it for me. Bye. Shush. All we need to do is take... Shush.